Hello, BookTube. There's a thing going around BookTube. It was created by Ali Ristal, and it was a sort of adapted to BookTube by Jess Bookgirl TV. It's the Quick to Judge challenge. I have been having a ball watching the videos that this challenge is inspiring, and it's close enough to a tag so that it feels right for a Tuesday. Some of the initial elements, some of the setup elements of the Quick to Judge challenge, I vigorously disagree with. We can't all agree on everything here. The idea is you pick 5 or 10 books from your shelves. I think one of the stipulations is 5 or 10 books that you haven't already read. That's a little bit of a high bar for me, but 5 or 10 books from your shelves. Read the first paragraph, or if you're a BookTube content creator, read the first paragraph out loud on camera. Assess it, rank it with all the other first paragraphs, and then at the end of the challenge, whether you've done 5 or 10 books, decide on the basis of those rankings which one will go on your TBR, which one will be on the pile of books you're going to read in the immediate future. And there are elements of that I don't like. There are elements of that seem to be pandering to the nanosecond attention span fostered by book talk. You, of course, do not want to judge whether or not a book is worth your time to read in its entirety on your TBR on the basis of its first paragraph. Of course, you don't want to do that. Of course, you don't want to signal to yourself or the broader world that that's as long as you can pay attention. But if we leave those elements aside, the bulk of this challenge is lots of fun because, at heart, it is a critical exercise. You're not just being asked, I mean, you could just do it, and some videos that I've watched and liked have just done it, where they read those opening paragraphs and just judge them on their lymph nodes. Just, what kind of a punch in my stomach does that give me? I'm not going to turn on my brain. I'm not going to think about it critically. I'm just going to ask, does it work for me? Does it move me? Plenty of people have done that. Plenty of people have not done that. Plenty of people have gone one step further and said, all right, well, I'm not going to judge this whole book and whether or not it's worth reading 300 pages on the basis of one paragraph, but I am interested in analyzing what that opening paragraph is actually doing. What kind of notes are being struck? What kind of promises is it making, maybe, to the reader? Now, we've all read books where the opening paragraph, the opening chapter, has nothing to do with the rest of the book, is not in any way indicative of the rest of the book. We've all read books like that, but it's still a fun critical exercise because it gets you thinking about the books you're reading in a critical way. Of course, I want to do another Quick to Judge challenge. I've done a bunch already. I did a couple for mammoth books that were huge and that would go along with March of the Mammoths, which is coming right up. But I thought I wouldn't concentrate so much on page length this day. We'd just go through 10 books and see what we make out of their first paragraph. But that's another change that I'm making on my version of this, in addition to all these other changes. The first paragraph in most books is meaningless. It's a meaningless distinction. So I want the opening note very parsimoniously judged. I'm not talking about the opening chapter here, but the opening note. It doesn't have to be just one paragraph, especially since so many books written in the last 30 years have succumbed to the fad of a one-sentence opening line. That won't do anybody, and one sentence won't do anybody any good. So for these 10 books, I want to talk about the opening note and some of the things that it says or doesn't say. I picked 10 books at random. Probably there's more nonfiction than fiction. I haven't really counted, but in my reading world, I go to nonfiction a lot more readily than I go to fiction. So the first one we'll do, I don't know why I picked this. I don't know why I picked any of these. The first one we'll do is a classic of fantasy fiction. This is Silverlock by John Myers. This is a very strange, very memorable fantasy novel that I think is foundational to a lot of what went after it for a lot of writers. A lot of writers read this and really, really liked it, although I don't see it get the love that it deserves. And I don't believe it's currently in print. But let's read how it begins. This also starts with a one-sentence paragraph, even though this was written in 1949. But we'll read the opening note here and see what it can tell us. If I had cared to live, I would have died. A storm had come up. While not sick, I found my bunk the most comfortable place, leaving it only to take my meals. Dozing after supper, I learned of disaster when a wave bashed in the door of my deck cabin. The backwash sluiced me out of it and stranded me by a storage locker. While I was still trying to figure out what was going on, I caught a glimpse of men trying to lower boats. The ship was low in the water, although through oversight or indifference, nobody had given me warning, any more than I would have bothered to take the trouble for them. At that, I was first over the side, for before I could get purchase anywhere, a following wave put me there. Okay, so that's the opening of Silverlock, and believe it or not, although there are no proper nouns and no details, we can actually learn a lot. We know, for instance, that John Myers is a great storyteller. That is gripping. You definitely want to know what happens next, which is, at least should be, don't tell my critical brethren this, but that should be the only yardstick by which we judge writing. Do you want to know what happens next? To the extent that you do, you are reading good writing. but there are other yardsticks, and I'm aware of them, and I honor them. But we know a couple of other things here, too. Perhaps John Myers is a little bit too much of a storyteller. He is not telling us anything here. He's so enraptured in the forward momentum of his prose that he's not bothering to tell us it's a ship. Obviously, we're on a ship. But a few specific details might have been nice. We get them right away, but not in that opening note. But there's one other thing, one very important thing in that opening note that we do get. Our narrator, Riley, says that through indifference or oversight, no one bothered to tell him that the ship was sinking. But then he immediately says that he wouldn't have bothered to tell anyone else if he'd learned first. That tells us a lot about him, and none of it's good. So that's intriguing right there, is that he's not shocked, he's not trying to help other people. And also that final note, he's not scrambling to make his place on a boat, he's not scrambling to get out of his cabin, he is thrown overboard, he's washed overboard. So that gives you a sense, it turns out it is actually a very accurate sense of what this book will be like. Headlong, and a little bit wry, a little bit subversive. But anyway, that's the opening of Silverlock. Now I'll move on to a gigantic work of history, an enormously impressive work of history. This is Hugh Thomas's book, The Slave Trade. Great big thing that is sweeping. It's sweeping on the darkest subject imaginable. So let's pass over his introduction and just read the beginning of chapter 1. Very early in the morning, because of the heat, a few Portuguese seamen on the decks of a half-dozen 100-ton caravels, the new sailing ships, were preparing on August 8, 1444, to land their African cargo near Lagos on the southwest point of Algarve in Portugal. Algarve in Portugal. This cargo consisted of 235 slaves. On arriving on the mainland, these people were placed in a field. They seemed to as a contemporary put it, quote, a marvelous sight, for amongst them were some white enough, fair enough, and well-proportioned. Others were less white, like mulattoes. Others again were as black as Ethiops, and so ugly, both in feature and body, as almost to appear images of a lower hemisphere. Still quoting. What heart could be so hard? This contemporary chronicler, Gomez Zurara, a courtier attached to the brother of the King of Portugal, the inventive Prince Henry, asked himself. But he's not just asking himself. We're reading him asking it. Quote, as not to be pierced with piteous feeling to see that company. For some kept their heads low, and their faces bathed in tears, looking upon one another. Others stood groaning very dolorously, looking up to the height of heaven, fixing their eyes upon it, crying out loudly, as if asking help from the Father of nature. Others struck their faces with the palms of their hands, throwing themselves full at length upon the ground, while others made lamentations in the manner of a dirge, after the custom of their country. So we have a contemporary eyewitness to the slave trade in 1444 describing that field of slaves that he looked at himself with his own eyes. And the note of this enormous, 800 pages? 900-page history of the slave trade? Therefore, the opening note of this book is piteous. It's emphatic, empathetic, and piteous, rather than financial or historical or dry or removed. That is very reassuring. And the quote brings us immediately into the eyewitness element of the subject, which is another way that the author is trying, I think, to defuse the anxiety of you coming across a 900-page history of the slave trade. A dedicated reader of history will look at this and smack their lips. They'll be happy to look at it. It will be the bigger the better. It will be, especially if you know Hugh Thomas's other books, which are all great. But a writer of a book like this from Simon & Schuster, with a cover price tag of nearly $40 is not going to want to appeal only to readers of history. This is going to be stacked in a bookstore. You're going to want to appeal to the general reader, who might balk at some of the outside characteristics of this thing, but you're giving them direct quotes. You're giving them eyewitnesses. You're naming the person who saw this and is telling you the story. You're letting someone else do the driving, in other words, at the very beginning of the first chapter. Very wise choice. Very wise. I could make broader comments. I could make broader comments. We'll just glance. Notice the courtier, when he is writing about the poor reactions of those people, saying some of them are crying out to heaven as to appeal to nature's God. It absolutely will not occur to Zurara that they might be appealing to anything that is the same God that he appeals to when he has gallstones. Instead, it's going to be nature's God. It's going to be some primitive deity or some abstraction. I might point out that if the tables were turned, and for plenty of Portuguese they were, and Zurara was in a field with 100 other people, and was calling out to God to save him, well, no God interfered on the part of those poor slaves, and no God would interfere on his part. If there are gods, they don't do that at all, no matter how great the injustice. That's a rant for another day. The main point is that is a fascinating way to open this book. Okay, let's do some biographies. You know I have a sweet tooth for biographies. Let's do some biographies. We'll start with a classic. This is Mrs. Jack by Louise Hall-Tharp. This is her great biography of Isabella Stewart Gardner, who lent her name to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum here in Boston. If you ever visit Boston, you simply must put that on your itinerary. No matter how short a time you're here, you'll very seldom see a museum like it. All major metropolitan areas have something like the Gardner. They all have their official art museum. Boston has the Museum of Fine Arts, great big state-of-the-art thing with careful plaques and tours and a foyer where you can have an overpriced meal and whatnot. They all have that. Right, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. But they all have something else. Usually they will have some quirky art museum that can often be intensely good. New York has the Frick, for instance. And the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum is that alternative here in Boston. And unlike a lot of other places, it's right next to the Museum of Fine Arts. So it's easy to take them both in. And this is a biography of Isabella Stewart Gardner, called Mrs. Jack here because she was the wife of Jack Gardner. Black Jack Gardner was an entrepreneur, I believe is the polite word we would use today. He was a big force of nature. He deserves a biography of his own. I don't think he's ever going to get one because he and everyone else at the time was completely overshadowed by his wife. But nevertheless, that's why this is called that. And we will read the first chapter. Not the first chapter, the first note, the opening note of the first chapter. The night was clear and cold, although snow had been forecast. A line of private carriages, which here and there a hired hack, circled a tall building standing solitary in partly reclaimed marshland. It was the evening of January 1st, 1903, and the brick building, referred to by the uninitiated as a Foyne brewery, was in fact a palace in the Venetian style, just completed in the Fenway, Boston, Massachusetts. This was the first social occasion at Fenway Court, and the hour, at least as stated on the engraved invitations, was, quote, 9 o'clock punctually. As each carriage stopped at the palace door, gentlemen in top hats alighted to assist their ladies, who gathered long skirts in white-gloved hands. Flickering carriage lamps shone on sealskin and sable. Diamonds flashed, half hidden in the furs. There were delays. Ladies were kept standing in the cold at the palace door. A tall Italian major domo, resplendent in green velvet, with a gold braid, admitted guests 2 by 2. And slowly the carriages circled, each awaiting its turn until the hour was no longer 9 punctually. So that's how this book starts, and right away you know what you're in for. That is incredibly inviting. It's incredibly colorful. It's also, this book was, let me see here. I ought to know this by heart. Yeah, this was originally written in 1965. A note that you will see in that opening, it was true then and is even more true now, that Louise is clearly describing a forgotten world, a lost world, and she's taking relish in doing it. the sealskin and the furs and the top hats and the long dresses and whatnot. She's describing a world that's long since vanished, even though she was halfway closer to it than we are. And I think it's canny. It's very good. It's not really indicative of the rest of the book, but it is canny of her to open her biography of Isabella Stewart Gardner with the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum with Fenway Court. She opens it with a building instead of a person, knowing perfectly well in 1965 that everybody knows the building, but nobody knows the woman. This was the first major commercial biography of Isabella Stewart Gardner. She's had 3 since then. All good in their own way, all with their own strengths and weaknesses. I happen to favor this one the most, even though I have a little bit of a personal stake in a couple of others. I still think this is the most charming one, and charm is certainly an evidence in that opening note. So let's miss it. Let's do another biography. Let's do the autobiography of Agatha Christie, which I have often linked this book to Backward Glance by Edith Wharton. For, I think, obvious reasons. The author is telling you a story as opposed to telling you the truth. But let's see how part 1 begins. Agatha Christie she worked on this book on and off for years. This was the thing she went to when she was just exhausted from the day's writing of the stuff that paid the bills. This would be in a cupboard or in a low desk drawer. She would pull that out and she would start to work on it. Lots of writers, especially very prolific, popular writers, and at the time that she was writing this, no one was more popular in the world, have a project like that. That they're pulling it out of a recess somewhere and just picking away at it over time. A lot of times those projects never get published. And I often wonder what that project is for some of our most popular writers today. They certainly have it. In their case, it might be a file on a computer as opposed to a stack of pages in a desk, but I feel certain that they have it. But anyway, let's see how she starts the story of her life. One of the luckiest things that can happen to you in life is to have a happy childhood. I had a very happy childhood. I had a home and a garden that I loved, a wise and patient nanny, a father and mother, 2 people who loved each other dearly and made a success of their marriage and of parenthood. Looking back, I feel that our house was truly a happy house. That was largely due to my father, for my father was a very agreeable man. The quality of agreeableness is not much stressed nowadays. People tend to ask if a man is clever, industrious, if he contributes to the well-being of the community, if he counts in the scheme of things. But Charles Dickens put the matter delightfully in David Copperfield, and then she quotes an exchange in David Copperfield. "Is your brother an agreeable man, Peggotty?" I inquired cautiously. "Oh, what an agreeable man he is," exclaimed Peggotty. Ask yourself that question about most of your friends and acquaintances, and you will perhaps be surprised at how seldom your answer will be the same as Peggotty's. By modern standards, my father would probably not be approved of. He was a lazy man. It was the days of independent incomes, and if you had an independent income, you didn't work. You weren't expected to. I strongly suspect that my father would not have been particularly good at working anyway. That is the opening of this book. I think there's one thing that stands out. I've never heard anyone say it about this book, but I don't hear people talk about this book at all. I think there's one element of that opening note that stands out pretty clearly, which is that it seems to be written for little children. Words, sentiments are repeated from sentence to sentence. How many times does the word happy appear in that one opening note? How many times does the word father appear in that opening note? How many subject, verb, object, simple sentences are there in that opening page? From a best-selling professional writer. It is either trying to demystify, again, to de-intimidate a memoir this big, although why Agatha Christie would think she needed to do that when the whole reading world would read this, or it's her subtle reflection on the simplicity of childhood. I don't believe that this author had a subtle bone in her body, so I'm not sure that I agree with that reading, but I'm curious to know about all of these. Does that pull you in? Does that intrigue you? I can attest that I have not picked a dull book here. So whether these openings are pulling you in or not, the books are worth your time. This is just I'm an absolute inveterate book recommender, so I can't help myself. Then we'll move on to another biography. Let's do a couple of books that sold gazillions of copies. our next two books, well, actually, our next three books can be books that sold enough copies to make their authors and all of their authors' progeny to the crack of doom independently wealthy. And regardless of how successful they were anywhere else. And the first one that we'll do is David McCullough's biography of John Adams, which you can find anywhere in any used bookstore at any time of the day or night. It is ready at any time. Let's see how this book starts. This is, of course, McCullough's big soup to nuts biography of America's second president, the diminutive John Adams. So the first chapter is called The Road to Philadelphia. In the cold, nearly colorless light of a New England winter, two men on horseback traveled the coast roads below Boston, heading north. A foot or more of snow covered the landscape, and remnants of a Christmas storm that had blanketed Massachusetts from one end of the province to the other. Beneath the snow, after 2 weeks of severe cold, the ground was frozen solid to a depth of 2 feet. Packed ice in the roads, ruts as hard as iron, made the going hazardous, and the riders, mindful of the horses, kept at a walk. Nothing about the harsh landscape differed from other winters, nor was there anything to distinguish the two riders. No sign of rank or title, no liveried retinue bringing up the rear. It might have been any year, and they could have been anybody, braving the weather for any number of reasons. Dressed as they were in heavy cloaks, their hats pulled low against the wind, they barely distinguishable from each other, except that the older, stouter of the two did most of the talking. He was John Adams of Braintree, and he loved to talk. He was a known talker. There were some, even among his admirers, who wished he talked less. He himself wished he talked less, and he had particular regard for those, like General Washington, who somehow managed great reserve under almost any circumstance. So that is the opening note of Chapter 1 of David McCullough's John Adams. It's obviously an affectionate portrait. We get a winter setting, like the opening of Mrs. Jack, and we're not told, in the very first brush of that opening note, who the other person is. Instead, we're told that the only thing that really distinguishes them is one is older and stouter. I can tell you that's not the only thing that distinguishes them. The older and stouter person of the two was also 1 whole foot shorter. Baby, why do you always do this? There's no way, baby girl. Here. Go on over there. There you go. You've got a smooth path here. Okay, now you don't have to content yourself there, because there's nowhere for you to go. There you go. Make a bed for yourself. There you go, baby. Oh, there's my baby girl. Oh, she's digging. She's making a hole for herself. She's making a mess. Oh, goodness. Oh, and those of you who have been asking every time I turn the camera to follow the bean action, there is no secret meaning to the weird writing on the back of that bookcase. I just haven't managed to paper it over or paint it over. But it's not a cryptic message of any kind. So, anyway, getting back to David McCullough's John Adams, one thing that you can certainly pick out from that opening note is affection. This is going to be a warm, affectionate biography. And it is. It's no less good for that. Notice all the specific details that we get there. The ground is frozen, and we're given the depth. The recentness of the storm, the hardness of the ruts. We're given very specific settings. And I don't believe that any of those notes struck anywhere in this book are random chance. I think that David McCullough not only knows the date in meteorological records of that recent snowstorm, but how deep the ground is frozen. I bet he knows that. I bet he researched that or had somebody do it. So that's that. And now we'll move on to a work of fiction, but this was also a gazillion seller. This is Anthony Doerr's book, All the Light We Cannot See, which has a little bit of a problem for our quick to judge challenge here, because it starts off staccato style. There are a couple of very brief little things, and then we get what I guess you could call the first chapter, but they're not numbered, and we don't know what they are. So we'll read. Let's read the first 2 little segments here. The first one really doesn't do anything. I don't think either one does together, but let's read the first 2 segments here and see what we make of it. First little segment is called Leaflets. At dusk, they pour from the sky. They blow across the ramparts, turn cartwheels over rooftops, flutter into the ravines between houses. Entire streets swirl with them, flashing white against the cobbles. Urgent message to inhabitants of this town, they say. Depart immediately to open country. The tide climbs. The moon hangs small and yellow and gibbous. On the rooftops of beachfront hotels to the east and in the gardens behind them, a half-dozen American artillery units drop incendiary rounds into the mouths of mortars. So those are, they here being described are the leaflets, which are dropped on a town that is about to be shelled by the Allies. So we can roughly get an idea that this is probably World War II. We don't know where the location is, but this was a common practice with U.S. forces. And then we'll move on to the next one, which is bombers, the natural next thing. They crossed the Channel at midnight, and Channel is capitalized. So you are gradually groping towards figuring out where and when this is set. There are 12, and they are named for songs. Stardust and Stormy Weather and In the Mood and Pistol Packin' Mama. The sea glides along far below, spattered with the countless chevrons of white caps. Soon enough, the navigators can discern the low, moonlit lamps of islands ranged along the horizon. France. Intercoms crackle. Deliberately, almost lazily, the bombers shed altitude. Threads of red light ascend from anti-air emplacements up and down the coast. Dark, ruined ships appear, scuttled or destroyed, one with its bow shorn away, a second flickering as it burns. On an outermost island, panicked sheep run zigzagging between rocks. Inside each airplane, a bombardier peers through an aiming window and counts to 20. 4, 5, 6, 7. To the bombardiers, the walled city on its granite headland, drawing ever closer, looks like an unholy tooth, something black and dangerous, a final abscess to be lanced away. So here we get the leaflets warning the town they're about to be bombed, and then we get a glimpse inside the bombers themselves before we move on to the city. I think we can agree this is very artsy writing. There are not spaces between houses. There are ravines. There are, what did we have here? Countless chevrons of whitecaps. It's very artsy writing, maybe even self-consciously so. I don't think obnoxiously so. I think it's rather good, rather evocative. And you can see why the author is doing this. This is unconventional. Those are too short to be chapters, and yet they are the first two things we get. And we get them in quick succession. You move from the town, which has been warned, to the people who are going to do the bombing. And I think that's wise. It's manipulative, but it's wise. You, having read those two, whatever they are, I don't know that they're chapters, but having read them in quick succession, and they're so short, you can't not read them in quick succession, you're definitely going to want to know the next thing, right? If the first thing is the leaflets warning the town, uselessly warning the town, that they're about to be bombed, and the second one is the bombers in flight, well, then the third thing is going to be the bombs falling, and the author knows that. He knows you're going to want to keep reading. That's good. That's a good way to start a book. So that's how that one opens. How many of you have read All the Light We Cannot See? Oh my, I wonder how many of you have. We'll stick with World War II. We'll go from All the Light We Cannot See to a classic of World War II history. This is At Dawn We Slept. Great big history of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And before the author gets down to the specifics that he really loves, this author really loves specifics, he gives a broader view, and that's his preface. I thought we'd start there as an opening. Pearl Harbor was more than one of the most daring and brilliant naval operations of all time. It was one of the turning points in history. The event provides a milestone at which to pause and take historical inventory. But in so doing, one should not credit to the event an entire generations of the world's developments. The temptation to do so is very real because those who lived through that period tend to divide their lives into two periods, before Pearl Harbor and after Pearl Harbor. It is also one of the greatest of all war stories. It combines so much, so suddenly, so unexpectedly, so spectacularly, in such brief and tragic compass. It embraced so much which, in the perspective of the years, still seems inexplicable and mysterious. But Pearl Harbor did not unfold with all the inevitability of a Greek tragedy. Pearl Harbor was not inevitable, is what he's saying. The operation was not, quote, an act of God. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of Japan, in chief of Japan's combined fleet and the initiator of the plan, might well have abandoned it if training in shallow water torpedo bombing had failed, if high-level bombing had proved unsuccessful, or if the United States had closed the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, thus cutting off his primary source of intelligence on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Then, too, the Naval General Staff strongly opposed his dangerous enterprise and could have refused to sanction it. What is more, the Japanese government could have decided against war with the United States. The options on both sides of the Pacific were in human hands, not in the lap of the gods. So that is authoritative, and yet pretty inviting. I read that for the first time a long time ago and thought, well, okay, everybody who was involved thought before Pearl Harbor and after Pearl Harbor. Might have been true after Pearl Harbor, but by the time this book came out, everybody thought in terms of before the war and after the war. I'm not sure that they were concentrating on Pearl Harbor, but this author has written an enormous, how long is this thing? 1,000 pages? 900 pages. He's written an enormous book on Pearl Harbor, and he knows, even back when this was written, that this is an ask, as the kids say. So when it comes to that sort of thing, either you as an author will write some interesting, palatable intro to your book, or your publisher will insist that you do so. And I think that works. It certainly works. It works a lot better than what this author wanted to do, which was to dive right away into mind-numbing specifics. Dates, times, hours, actual specific minutes. He does that later in the book, all through the book, and it works really well. But only because, I think, largely because for general readers who don't know everything about Pearl Harbor, he has situated the importance of the event. He's introduce the element of the drama before he gives you the dramatis personae. I think that's wise. But do you? What do you think? Then we'll move on to a work of fiction, and another work of fiction that scarcely needs introduction from me, Tarzan of the Apes, by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is the Penguin classic of the first Tarzan novel. It has an absolutely wonderful opening, so it's going to be a pleasure to read it again. This is the beginning of chapter 1. I had this story from one who had no business to tell it to me, or to any other. I may credit the seductive influence of an old vintage upon the narrator for the beginning of it, and my own skeptical incredulity during the days that followed for the balance of the strange tale. When my convivial host discovered that he had told me so much, and that I was prone to doubtfulness, his foolish pride assumed the task the old vintage had commenced. And so he unearthed written evidence in the form of musty manuscript and dry official records of the British Colonial Office to support many of the salient features of his remarkable narrative. I do not say the story is true, for I did not witness the happenings which it portrays, but the fact that in the telling of it you have taken fictitious names for the principal characters quite sufficiently evidences the sincerity of my belief that it may be true. That is the beginning of Tarzan of the Apes, and it's forgotten in the wash of Tarzan that followed. This was All Fantasy Magazine. This was a huge success. It came out as a book. It was a huge success. It has adapted to the movies and became a huge success. Comic books. It had many other books and sequels. There have been precious few Tarzan pastiche novels, but that's mainly because Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated seems to have its you-know-what up its you-know-what. so they don't tend to authorize Tarzan novels. But they authorize comics, and there were lots of books that Edgar Rice Burroughs went on to write. In fact, he had a little bit of Arthur Conan Doyle syndrome. He felt trapped by this author, by this character, by how popular this character was. And because of that wash of all subsequent writing, all those other adventures, Roman legions lost in time, tiny men, monkey men, La, the priestess of Opar, because of all of that, we tend to forget what that introduction tells us, which is that we don't know the names of any of these characters, including Tarzan. Those names have been changed because some of those people are still alive. And we also don't know if the story is true. Any of it is true. But let's say this initial story, the story of the child of the British aristocracy, who is orphaned and then adopted by a race of strange gorilla-like beings that raise him as one of their own, so that he's a naked savage who thinks he's an animal raised in the jungle until suddenly he realizes that he's not. A classic tale, much like Mowgli from the Jungle Books grown up. That introduction tells us that some of this, or maybe all of it, might not be true. If the story was told originally to the first interlocutor, which Edgar Rice Burroughs did this in his John Carter novels too. That interlocutor is almost certainly Burroughs himself. But the idea here is that how much of this story was that vintage concoction, that vintage port, and how much of it is true? And what are these documents in this journal from the British Foreign Office? What are they? Writers that I know who have been Tarzan fans, hugely encyclopedic Tarzan fans over the decades, have had a field day with the opening of this book and the closing of this book. I love it, though, and boy, oh boy, talk about invitations to a narrative. That is a story told by a born storyteller. You want to know what this fantastic yarn is. You absolutely do. So that's the beginning of Tarzan of the Apes. We're almost done here. Long video, but we're almost done. We've got 2 more books. We will move now to David Goldblatt's great book, The Ball is Round. His Global History of Soccer. Terrific book that has a bit of a strange opening. So we're gonna indulge. We're gonna give him a little bit of leeway here. Because his introduction is a little bit strange. We'll go to part 1. And the reason that it's strange is because he gives an epigraph to the chapter and then sets up a dialogue with the epigraph, which most writers don't do. The first chapter is called Chasing Shadows, the Prehistory of Football. It starts with an epigraph from Sepp Blatter, who was FIFA president once upon a time. And his quote is, "Football is as old as the world. People have always played some form of football, from its very basic form of kicking a ball around to the game it is today." So that is just that, all by itself. And then the author writes in response to that as the beginning of his first chapter. Is it? Have we? So he's directly responding to the statements that Blatter made. Let us forgive the president of FIFA his hyperbole. Let us not take him at his word. Football, at the very least, requires feet. The emergence of biped hominids, whose feet and hands are sufficiently differentiated that they can trap and kick or catch or throw rather than paw, pad, or shove, can be dated to around 2 million years ago. And some of you who have grown up on farms are saying, what? Is this author saying you need feet and hands to kick a ball and enjoy it? Obviously never seen what happens if you throw a ball into a horse paddock. But anyway, the world is somewhat older. And the ball? Let us forgive Blatter his carelessness with the archaeological record, for there is no evidence of any human-manufactured spear that can be kicked before 2000 BCE. Again, the author seems maybe innocent of farm animals, who very much love playing with balls, and often seem to be developing their own rules, but also innocent of world travel, where anything roughly spherical and can certainly be used. You do not need a stitched ball. You can use the head of a slaughtered horse, for instance, in a famous folklore game, or the head of a slaughtered pig, or, in very ancient times, a human skull will work just fine. Or even a human head, before it becomes a human skull. But we get what he's saying. He's being nitpicky here in order to introduce his subject. Perhaps those stitched ancient Egyptian balls were kicked, but the hieroglyphic and mural evidence only shows throwing. No doubt people have been kicking fruit and gourds for longer, rocks and pebbles at a pinch, skulls perhaps, or any manner of roughly spherical object that the world throws up. He's giving out the possibilities, but he's about to zero in on the joy, on the attraction of his subject matter. Of course they have. It is an irresistible act to spy the object, to imagine its future trajectory, to shape and balance one's body and then to take a mighty swing. Better still, there comes the delicious moment of impact and the always extraordinary sensation of energy and motion passing from one's leg to the inanimate object. It soars into the air. It scuds across the field. It finds its target, or perhaps it bounces, tumbling, spinning on an unimagined course. This is not football. This is play. Which shows you among the main thing this shows you is that you're in the hands of a terrific writer, a terrific storyteller, a playful storyteller. And that holds true throughout this book, which has a lot of history to impart and also a lot of really sordid squabbling and politics, all done wonderfully, just glowingly. So even if you're not interested in football, what Americans call soccer, which I most emphatically am not, the book is still going to completely captivate you, just completely. It is the best book ever written on the subject. Then we'll finish up with a memoir, a famous memoir. I have a lot to say about this book, but we won't say it here. This is Brennan Gill, and this is his memoir here at the New Yorker, where he was a New Yorker staple and decided to write a memoir about his life at the magazine, pretty close to the dawn of its existence. And of course, the New Yorker this year is 100 years old. I don't know that anyone is reprinting this book. I don't know that anyone has thought to do that. I don't know that all the various people out there who have various copyright holdings to the various books that have been written about the New Yorker are missing a great opportunity if they don't reprint their books. Certainly this one, which sold more than any other New Yorker memoir. This ought to be reprinted in the year of our Lord 2025. But Brendan Gill, all right, I have my things to say about him, but we don't have to do it now. We are going to look at how he starts his memoir of his time at the New Yorker, and quintessentially, predictably, characteristically, he starts it off with a picture of himself. But eventually he gets down to words. This is how he starts chapter 1. Happy writers have histories shorter even than happy families. An allusion to Anna Karenina. He's trusting that you'll get the echo. The whole of my professional career can be summed up by saying that I started out at the place where I wanted to be the most, the New Yorker magazine, and with much pleasure and very little labor have remained here ever since. Sometimes, and with reason, I boast of never having done an honest day's work in my life. An honest day's play, oh, that I have accomplished on 1,000 occasions, or 10,000. But work implies a measure of drudgery and fatigue, and these are states as yet unknown to me. With the New Yorker serving as my passport and letter of credit, how easy I have found it for almost 40 years to rush pell-mell through the world, playing the clown when the spirit of darkness has moved me, and colliding with good times at every turn. That is the opening paragraph of chapter 1. Let's read just a bit more. It doesn't feel right to read a paragraph of Brendan Gill when he is not name dropped. I mean, he dropped the name of the New Yorker, and he's also confessed to being an idle gadabout, but he hasn't dropped any actual person's names, and that means you're practically not reading him. I bet he needs only one more paragraph to drop a name. Such a confession will no doubt make unwelcome reading to my colleagues, for the fashion among them is to hold that writing is a prolonged and disenchanting misery. A friend of mine, Patrick Kavanagh, there we go, bing, bing. A friend of mine, Patrick Kavanagh, who was the premier poet of Ireland after Yeats, said of the peasantry from which he sprang that they live in the dark cave of the unconscious and they scream when they see the light. You'll find in the course of this book, coincidentally enough, if you listen to Brendan Gill's narration, that he never had any friends who weren't famous. They scream when they see the light. Now, most New Yorker writers share this attribute with Irish peasants. They tend to be lonely, mole-like creatures who work in their own portable, if not peasant, darkness, and who seldom utter a sound above a groan. It happens that I am not like that. On the contrary, I am among those who enjoy the light, and even to a certain extent, the limelight. A predilection that it has its hazards. Once I was showing off at a cocktail party, and I mentioned some very arcane fact that we had dug up for Talk of the Town. That's a feature in the New Yorker. And like that, St. Ambrose was the first person in history reputed to have been able to read without moving his lips. Somebody asked me how I knew that, and I replied grandly, I know everything. And a pretty girl was there, an Italian model, and she looked up at me with great melting dark eyes and said softly, Tell me about the Battle of Mukden. I burst out in dismay. Mukden, the Battle of Mukden. For sure enough, I knew nothing whatever about that very important event. And the first picture before himself is Harold Ross, the founder of the New Yorker. I think you can agree that is enchanting. When you're writing a memoir, or especially a workplace memoir, you can either interest your reader in the workplace or the subject matter. We've seen a couple of examples of that. Or you can just strike a tone and strike a tone in a way that encourages your reader to not care so much about the subject because it's going to be you. You're going to be the reason they keep reading. And Brendan Gill characteristically decides to do that. That he's going to be the reason that you read this book. And it could be here at the mechanic shop. It doesn't have to be here at the New Yorker. It can be anywhere, and it will still work. And far be it from me to fly in the face of the judgment of sales. This did work. To put it mildly, this did work. I myself think there's a lot of poisonous stuff going on below the surface here, including one serious thing that has had repercussions ever since. Maybe not Brendan Gill's intention, but I don't think there's anything in here that was unintentional. But the one thing you can say for sure, you know right away from that opening, which is that this is an utterly charming book. This is a book written by a man whose job was charm. And he was good at his job. So there you go. That is the beginning of Here at the New Yorker. So there you go. There's some... Oh, well, this video was long. Sorry about that. This video was a few more samples for the Quick to Judge challenge, which is rushing all over book 2. I urge you to do this You don't have to go on for 45 minutes, but I urge you to do this. If you have a BookTube channel, even if you've done it already, pick 10 more books. Read the first paragraph and just talk about what it makes you feel. You don't have to go into the enormous, windy critical apparatus, but read it out loud to me and tell me what you think of it. What are the initial effects that it has, especially if it's something you haven't already read, but even if it's something you have already read. It might be fun to do. Take down, a book that you've read many, many times and read its opening paragraph and think a little about what it's actually doing. And don't just think. Tell me what it's actually doing. But I'd love to hear it. Feel free, all of you, to do this and keep doing it. This is wonderful. And to be fair, I know I ranted at the beginning of this video about book talk, but to be fair, these opening notes, not so much specifically the opening paragraph, but these opening notes do mean a lot. For all of us. They do mean a lot. It's very rare that someone browsing in a bookstore, for instance, will pick up a volume that's unknown to them and turn to the middle. They turn to the opening note. They turn to the beginning. Does it hook them? You've done that. I've done that. So this challenge is really interesting in that regard. So feel free to read paragraphs to me. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.